Question number 36 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 3. In passage 2, the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have done what? So realize 37 is a quote question that supports 36. But we need to find when passage 2 the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders. This is a very precise question. I think this is a type of question that would be very easily answered with the quotes if we do the quotes first. But let's see if we can take a stab at 36 on its own. We only care about society's leaders. And what have they done? Freedoms granted by society's leaders have done what? Privilege one gender over the other. Well, remember, passage 2 is Mary Wollstonecraft, and that's what she believes, right? She says that when men contend, line 73, when men contend for their freedom and be allowed to judge for themselves respecting their own happiness, it not be inconsistent and unjust to subjugate women, even though you firmly believe that you are acting in the manner best calculated to promote their happiness. Who is acting in the manner best calculated? Isn't that going to be the lawmakers? Isn't that going to be the people who decide and make laws, make government? Next sentence, who made man the exclusive judge, if women partake with him the gift of reason? So if both men and women have the same ability to think, who let men decide for everyone what would happen? So maybe freedoms granted by society's leaders have privileged one gender over the other. Would Mary Wollstonecraft agree with that? That government has made one gender, privileged and the other not so privileged? Yeah, she would agree with that. That's exactly the point she's arguing. Notice how A, right off the bat, right, it hits you right as you're reading this question. I always think that sometimes they put the right answers that confuse you to stun you with A. Like they have like A and it's there to stun you because you don't even understand what the question's asking, and already the wording of the answer choice is like bizarre. Privileged one gender over the other? Why would you say that? Why would freedoms granted by society have made men superior to women, or who have granted men better powers and authority over women? They don't say that. They don't say things like that. They mask the right answer to make it right, even though on its surface it doesn't appear to be so. The author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have privileged one gender over the other. Yeah, it has privileged. Laws have made men superior to women. That is privileging one gender over the other. Tough question. Let's go to B. In passage 2, the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have resulted in a general reduction in individual virtue. Excellent bad answer. A lot of people pick this because it sounds good. That's like the reason. Freedoms granted have resulted in a general reduction in individual virtue, because you might remember in the beginning it's saying, because they use the word virtue, that's like a bait. That's like a lure. They know that you'll remember that word because it's so unique. Starts with a V. And you'll remember like, oh, I think I remember something about virtue. Yeah, people, reduction in virtue, something about women not being educated with men, and then you fill in the gap and pick that. Does the author of passage 2 ever say that and we have to answer a very particular question, freedoms granted by society's leaders have resulted in a general reduction in individual virtue? Does she ever say that virtue, or your morality and your uprightness has gone down as a result of laws that people have passed? Does she ever say that? She doesn't say that things are on the decline. She says if men and women are not educated the same, then women will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue. Stopping the process of knowledge and virtue does not mean that there has been a reduction in individual virtue. And again, I don't like the fact that we're categorizing it as being individual virtue. Individual virtue means like how morally pure you are, or like how virtuous you are. Good bad answer, because it hits on like a lot of different parts of the piece, but it actually doesn't even answer the question, and it's a nonsense answer to begin with. The author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders, so the freedoms that society's leaders have granted have resulted in a reduction in virtue. The only time that we talk about virtue is when we say if women are not as educated as men, then we will stop the progress of virtue. Stopping the progress of virtue doesn't mean that things are currently on the decline with respect to virtue. So this is a really good bad answer because it sounds good. And I have to go back to always zoom in and out of these questions sometimes. Sometimes we can get so, we have our horse blinders on and we're so fixated on one answer choice and we're arguing with it. Look at A. Is A wrong? No, A's not wrong. How is it possible to argue that, passage 2 doesn't believe that society has privileged one gender over the other? That's why she's writing this piece in the first place. If that weren't true, there would be no debate. There would be no argument as to what women should do or shouldn't do. So when you're really sometimes like beating up an answer choice and you're like, oh, on one hand this, but on the other hand, look at the other answer choices and see like, oh yeah, that's right. That's going to be true because it's impossible to prove wrong. So even with B, I don't like the nuance of it. I don't like the way that they're trying to say things that mean nothing, even though on the surface it sounds really good, when A is just not wrong. Let's look at C. In passage 2, the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have, C, caused arguments about the nature of happiness. Again, do we ever remember in the passage that freedoms granted by society's leaders have caused arguments about the nature of happiness? They might cause arguments about the nature of gender roles in society, but has it caused arguments about like, well, what does happiness mean? That's getting us a little bit tangled up with what Talleyrand believes, where he says, you know, the net benefit, the average happiness of everyone is the thing that we care about. So maybe he might argue about the nature of happiness or whether or not that's right or not, but she never broaches that subject. She never says anything about the general happiness of people. She talks about it in terms of what's right and logical with respect to the individuals. So causes argument about the nature of happiness. We're not having a philosophical discussion about what is the nature of happiness. What about D? In passage 2, the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have ensured equality for all people. Not true. Because if that were true, we wouldn't be having this argument. Passage 2, Wollstonecraft, who fully acknowledges the inequality among women in the world, does not agree that that society has ensured equality for all. Not true. Passage 2, the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have, A, privileged one gender over the other. I like that. I like the answer to 36 is going to be A. It might seem like it's like very muddy to figure out like what 36 answer is, because maybe it's A, maybe it's B, maybe it's C even. What I really would have done, I think, because the quote exists next, I would probably have left A, B, and C. I know D's wrong. I'm leaning towards A because it seems to be the least bad answer. It seems impossible to prove wrong. But I would answer the quotes now and just answer a very particular question. Freedoms granted by society's leaders. What have society's leaders done? And I'll find a quote that talks about what society's leaders have done. There's only one quote that talks about what society's leaders have done. That's how these questions are formed. And then I can back solve and be more confident, okay, the answer is going to be A. I think the answer for 36 is going to be A, but let's take a look at the quotes to be sure. Question number 37 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 3. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So the previous question was talking about how the author claims in passage 2, Mary Wollstonecraft believes that the freedoms granted by society's leaders have done something. We think the answer is going to be A, privilege one gender over the other, only because like it's true. It's something that can't be proven wrong. Because that's her whole point. That's her whole argument, that men and women are not equal and they ought to be. So let's find a quote, but let's pretend like these answer choices don't exist. Even if we think the answer is going to be A, let's pretend like these answer choices don't exist. Let's just answer a very particular question. The author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have what? What have the freedoms granted by society's leaders have done? Let's see if 41 to 45 talks about the freedoms granted by society's leaders have done something. Contending for the rights of women, my main argument is built on this simple principle, that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue. That doesn't have anything to do about freedoms granted by society's leaders have done something. That's just saying women ought to be educated. Okay? It has nothing to do with society's leaders and the freedoms granted by them, so I'm not liking A. What about B? Does B talk about freedoms granted by society's leaders? Again, notice how tight the question I'm asking is. Freedoms granted by society's leaders. Just talk about that. And that's the only thing. Be relentless in that approach. Truth must be common to all or it will be inefficacious with respect to the influence on general practice. What does that have to do with the freedoms granted by society's leaders? Nothing. It's saying the exact same thing as before, that virtue and knowledge will stop progressing. 65 to 66. Does this talk about freedoms granted by society's leaders? If so, on what does your constitution rest? Your, referring to Talleyrand. Okay? That's when she's bringing up his logical inconsistency, where he says, it's impossible to argue for why women don't deserve rights. And then she says, well then why are you writing a piece about it? If so, on what does your constitution rest? If so, what do you believe then? That has nothing to do with what society's leaders have done. Notice again, with this type of question, it's much easier to be like, no, no, no. Even though we're confused about 36, is it A, B, C? You know, some of them seem tempting. What about D, 72 to 75? Does this talk about society's leaders and what they've done? Consider, I address you as a legislator. So I like legislator means someone who makes a law. So consider I address you as, so like pretend that I'm a lawmaker. Pretend that I'm a judge. Pretend that I'm someone who delegates what's right and wrong. Whether, when men contend for their freedom and be allowed to judge for themselves respecting their own happiness. And that's where the quote ends. So that's saying, assume that I'm a lawmaker, I'm a judge, and I tell you, is it fair for men to judge for their own freedom? Notice how they talk about freedom, I like that. We talk about lawmakers and we talk about freedom in this quote. When men contend and men make rules for themselves, when men contend for their freedom and to be allowed to judge for themselves respecting their own happiness. And then even though it's not part of the quote, let's read a little bit after for context. It be not inconsistent and unjust to subjugate women, even though you firmly believe that you are acting in a manner best calculated to promote their happiness. Who made man the exclusive judge? Yeah. What does she say that has happened? That men are able to make judgment for themselves, and they're able to make judgment on women as well, but women don't have that same right. So, the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have done what? If we look at answer for 36, what we think was A, privilege one gender of the other. That makes sense because men are able to make judgments for themselves and women, but women are not able to make judgments for men or themselves. So that is privileging one gender over the other. We're talking about a freedom that some people have, the ability to judge, the ability to make rules and to decipher what's right and wrong, by society's leaders. I address you as a legislator. I address you, is it right for men to judge? You know, in the abstract, the principles of governance, men being in positions of power. Is that fair? I really like on how 37D talks about, it hits all the points. With respect to freedom, the freedoms granted by society's leaders have done what? They've made men superior to women, and they've made women subordinate to that of men. D for 37 nicely matches up with 36A. The freedoms granted by society's leaders have privileged one gender over the other. That's the answer that's irrefutable for 36. It can't be proven wrong. It's just true. If we go back to B, I think B is a really tempting answer for 36, resulting in a general reduction of individual virtue. What? That none of the quotes, even though that first quote had the word virtue in it, right? So like it was very easy to see that as the last one, be like, oh, virtue, that has to be the answer. When do they ever say there was a reduction in virtue? It's just saying if women aren't educated, we can't continue the progress of virtue. So realize B for 36 was a red herring. It seemed good, but it actually wasn't even answering the question. Freedoms granted by society's leaders have been unfair. The answer to 36 is A, nicely matches up with the quote for 37, D. Very hard question.